Welcome to Mediumship Moments with psychic medium Kim Dorham. Join her as she shares her personal journey with mediumship, connects with your loved ones, and discusses topics dealing with spirituality.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mediumship Moments. I'm your host, Kim Dorham, second-gen psychic medium, and I am thrilled, and I say this lovingly, thrilled to have Penny Hawkins Smith with me, a registered nurse, a 20-year hospice nurse. She's known at Hospice Nurse Penny on social medias. Welcome. Hello. Thank you so much for being our guest today. I'm thrilled. Nurses get together. We have quite the stories that we can shop talk, as I call it, about what we can talk about. And today I'd like to talk about your journey into becoming a hospice nurse, the bumpy road before, if you want to touch upon that and the journey. Maybe talk about some of the cases that really touched you. And I say cases, we're trying to keep it HIPAA, but some of the people that touched you in a pretty special way. You talked about, and I want to bring up here her book, Influencing Death. It is an amazing read. And I say that having just lost my dad in the last year and my father-in-law, and we lost two in 1 year, that, even though I'm a healthcare professional, walking that journey of hospice, it's one of those, you never want to be a member of the club. And then when you're a member of the club, you're so damn happy that you had that membership and you had that support. So Penny, share with me about how you got into being a hospice nurse.
Well, as you said, it was a little bit of a bumpy path, a rocky road. I didn't go to nursing school until I was 40 years old. I, in my earlier life, had been quite the problem child, problem adult.
Coloring outside the lines, the circle are my kind of people. In nursing, they often say, right, better to ask for forgiveness than permission. You're a perfect candidate, right?
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So went to jail a few times, had a drug addiction, gave my son to his dad to raise, which really, to me, in my heart, was the worst of it. Giving my son to his dad when he was 4 so that I could party more. But finally started to turn my life around when I was about 27 years old and eventually got my son back.
When he was about 8 years of age, I think, right? About that?
He was 10.
Was he 10?
10.
Okay.
He was 10. Well, I started seeing him on a regular basis when he was 10. And then he moved in with me when he was just a teenager.
And it made your family whole. Grade. I can't imagine.
Yeah.
Being a mother, you're a mom 24/7. So, like, you were honest enough to say that your addiction, which is a chronic disease, and finally we're starting to understand the disease process of addiction, and it's not just the shame and stigma of they're just bad people. So I think it's great that you're so honest and open about that journey. And we're able to, through the journey of they wasn't ready to stop partying, start bringing him back into your life. So at that point, he's 10. You've got your single mom of 2, I believe.
No, I remarried when he was 10.
Okay.
And then I had 2 kids, 2 daughters to add to the bunch. And was a stay-at-home homeschooling mom for a long time. But 10 years into my second marriage, my ex-husband, and I decided to get divorced. But because I had been a stay-at-home mom, and prior to that, I'd been a bartender, I didn't really have a career to fall back on that would, support me in a way that made sense for me to be a single mom with child support doesn't pay a whole lot. So I decided that I will go to nursing school. And about a year before I went to nursing school, my husband's stepmother got cancer and died on hospice. And I was just so impressed by the nurses. I felt like they were really doing sacred work. And so when I decided to become a nurse, I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to do something that makes me feel like I am giving back to the universe, like really service work. And all nursing is service work, but to me, it felt like a little level up to be doing this kind of work with dying people. I also had severe death anxiety. And I thought, well, maybe this will help my death anxiety. So
wow. So it's interesting, the death anxiety. Do you know where that came from? Was there a loss in your family that was the catalyst behind it?
I would say I first of all think death anxiety is extremely common, which is something I didn't know until I got on TikTok. But for me, I think it was the generation that I grew up in. Parents did not really address death appropriately. We went from people dying in the home with the whole family there to putting them in the hospital and having them die in the hospital and keeping our kids sheltered from that. And when my grandfather died when I was probably 10 or 11 years old, my mom just said, and I'm like, what's death? Basically, he went to sleep and he's never going to wake up again. And that was terrifying to me. Like, I couldn't sleep for a long time after that.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of for me where it stemmed. But I also think just my theory is, generally speaking, people are afraid of death because we don't talk about it. It's a very taboo topic. So that makes it scarier. So also not talking about it makes it more unknown to us, and things that we don't know about are scarier. But also, we go through life when we're younger, like waiting for the next thing. When we're kids, we're waiting for summer break, we're waiting for Christmas, then we're waiting to get to turn 16 so we can drive, then we're waiting to turn 18 so we can be adults, then we're waiting to turn 21 to be able to drink alcohol. Then there comes a point when the next thing that we're waiting for is the end of our life, is our death. And then that's like, like our mortality kind of is then all of a sudden in front of us. And because we don't talk about it, it's just, it just adds another layer of fear to that. So it's just really a common thing to have death anxiety.
And it's when you bring that up, because it's cultural over acceptance of death, right? So different cultures have a different take on it and rituals behind it. The reason why we started embalming bodies is because of the Civil War. So they could ship them back. And that's when the funeral, a very powerful lobby group, and started the basically the laws about how a body could be cared for, shall we say. And it moved from, like you said, I come from an Irish and Italian background, and the Irish, you'd have a wake. It would be a party. He'd be on the dining room table, and there was a celebration where the Italians, they'd actually pay mourners to come and mourn, professional mourners, because it was seen as something taboo or a different way to celebrate it. But it's interesting how that anxiety plays out with kids. In your 20 years since you touched about it, the death of, you had resources, which I think are lovely in your book about that. Is being a hospice nurse of a child obviously different in your journey as a hospice nurse? Like, is there a subset specialty? Let me just say that. There's pediatric nurses. Are there pediatric hospice nurses?
There are, in agencies where they can afford to have specialized pediatric hospice nurses, but there are some agencies that are small that use their regular hospice nurses to be pediatric hospice nurses. I saw pediatric patients occasionally as a hospice nurse, but I was not a pediatric hospice nurse, and I didn't want to be one, mostly not because of dealing with the dynamics of the family, which can be highly emotional, but it's very complex case management because they do continuous care. So they're doing, treatment while they're on hospice, which is something adult hospice patients don't do. So it's really, really complex. But in terms of the family, so for the few children that I saw, it was really sobering to see, when a child gets to the point of being on hospice, they're usually more accepting of what's happening than their parents are. Like I have a 5-year-old patient who I went to see her, and she asked if she could have Ativan. Can I have some Ativan now? And she was 5 years old and was getting IV push Ativan. And it was mind blowing to me that a 5-year-old knew what Ativan was, knew what it was for, knew to ask for it. And it's such a long journey. I think by the time, well, it's usually a long journey, not always, but by the time the death is happening. They're dying. I think, and again, this is just anecdotal based on what my colleague pediatric hospice nurses have said to me, is that there's a little bit more acceptance of what's going on. It's still hard, they still don't want it, but they're just a little more accepting of it.
I asked this because it's fresh in my brain. I just had a client sit with me, and she actually was my next door neighbor growing up in Philadelphia. And I remember her dearly. She has a very unusual name. She lost a son to leukemia at the age of 11. And she talked about him seeing the transition team, which is those that come to help us cross over. And I'm sure you have experiences of that too. And talked about how accepting he was over his death. And it made it that much easier, in a sense, for the parents to let go, that he made it easier because he was ready.
So when you say transition team, are you talking about deathbed visioning?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Because transitioning is used in different ways. So in hospice, transition means going from a place of being more living and less dying to this transition period to where you're more dying than you are living. It's actually not, the death is not referred to as transition. It's this period of time before the death, before they're actively dying, that's transition. So that's interesting that you call it that.
I used to call it I tried to come up with the welcoming committee or something.
The welcoming committee.
Yeah. Yes. Where as a nurse, I could see like Mr. Smith in room 10. He was supposed to be discharged the next day. Having this ability, the room would be very busy, very active in Mr. Smith's room. And I'm like, do I move the crash cart down? I don't want to be known as the angel of death. But in that sense, that I could predict forlorn, and then it gets a little gray hairy with my license about this ability I have and what I'm my scope of my practice there, right? And so the transition team, I just talk about it that we never cross alone. That there's always, I see 2 to 4 people, right, who are there to help us cross, whether it's family, friends, colleagues. And I lovingly say they're there to help us, give us a hand, get our butt off to Angel Boot Camp, get a set of wings, let us learn how to use them, and throw a hell of a banger after we complete that, is what I kind of say.
And with children, often it's more animals that they see. There's a doctor that actually did a study on that, especially younger children who have not had the experience of a lot of death in the family will often see pets more than they see people. There's a doctor that actually did a study interviewing hospice patients, adults and pediatrics.
And that's fascinating. Now, and I'm going to segue. Do they see their former pets or just animals?
I think he said just animals in general, that they see animals in general. Yeah. And I also think, so people usually will see the people that, at least that's what they express to us in hospice, is that they see people who they knew in life who were now dead. But sometimes people will say they see people they don't recognize, or that they see people that are still living. So I think sometimes when they say they're visioning people that are still living, they might be visioning people who have died who look like my daughter is a ringer for my grandmother. So I could see where if I was dying, I might be seeing my grandmother in a younger state, thinking that it was my daughter, or that people see people they don't recognize because they could be connected to other people and they don't recognize them because they don't know them in life, but in death they're there. But usually it's people they recognize and they know who have died. I think we're all connected anyway. That's my belief anyway.
Right. And I agree with you. And it's interesting what you touched upon, Hospice Nurse Penny, is that when they show up to chat with me, they always come back their best selves here. So it's often young. It's 30, fabulous, firm, fresh from the Medi Spa, which would resemble a family member, a current family member. Right. I often say that they never come back the dried up little raisin they may have been when they earned their wings. So you went through this bumpy journey. You're open and honest about it. I love that. There's no secrets in Influencing Death. Okay, which you can get on Amazon and where else, love? through your
Oh,
website?
everywhere. It's sold online. Barnes and Noble. Yeah, my website, hospicenursepenny.com.
Yeah. So she's so
Links to it
honest,
everywhere.
right, about your journey. So, a single mom, here you are, you go to school, and now you're able to care for your kids in a very noble way. And I say that and giving back. I mean, like, it's all about giving back, but karmically, maybe righting some wrongs over that. And
Yeah.
what was your first like hospice like? I imagine nervous as hell, but what was that like? Like going in there to care for that first patient?
I don't remember my specific, the first patient, especially people ask me, what about the first patient that died? Do you remember that? And I don't, but I remember the first time I had an experience that really stuck with me. And that was when I had a patient who her daughter was a nun. And so there were all kinds of nuns visiting her. And one evening, the last visitor came out of the room and she was a nun. And she walked up to the nurse's station and she said, "She's gone." And I said, "Oh," and I stood up and grabbed my stethoscope and she said, "No, no, no. She's still, her body is still here doing the work of dying, but her spirit has left. You can see it in her eyes." And so as soon as she left, I went into the room because I was like, what is she talking about? And I went into the room and I saw this woman and I could see what she meant. Like the lights were on, but nobody was home. The eyes were open. She just had this fixed, glassy gaze. And it was like she was not in there anymore. And so that was really something that I have always, you know, kept with me, that first experience. Other than that, I don't even remember, like, been 20 years ago. So I was, a new nurse. I actually, didn't go in. I went into working in a clinic, a family practice clinic for 1 year. And then I worked in a med surg transfer unit for 3 months. And I was an LPN, so I wasn't an RN. And then I went into the hospice care center. So I was like I was an old nurse, but I was a young nurse. I was a new nurse. And so I really don't even remember, like, what that was like for me. But
You're just trying
because
to survive
I'm learning.
and
Yeah,
not
I'm
kill
learning not
anybody,
only about
right? After you get
I'm
your
not only
license.
I'm not only learning about the dying process, I'm learning how to do wound care in ways that you don't do, like traditional wound care for hospice patients, because they have wounds like you've never seen. And I'm learning how to do IV push meds and program pumps and, like doing all these things. So nothing really stuck with me. And plus I'm learning about the dying process, and which was fascinating to me because having no experience with death and having death anxiety, seeing people dying and watching how they go through kind of the same thing, the dying process is very similar, was something that was just fascinating to me. I was like, oh wow, okay. Like there was this whole idea of, okay, like our bodies know how to die. They're all doing it the same way. Clearly, this is something, a biological response to the end of life, and we know how to die. And so that was just so interesting to me.
Here's a question I want to piggyback on with the nun. Have you ever seen the soul leave the body?
No, I've never seen that, but I'm not clairvoyant. But what I have experienced is a shift in the room in the energy when someone
Okay.
dies.
I would
There's
love to hear that.
definitely a different feeling when someone dies. You can just feel the energy has changed in a way, in some way. I can't describe it. I can just say that if you're there and you witness the death, you can feel that, like something is just different when someone dies. But I've never seen, the spirit leaving the body. I haven't really known very many hospice nurses or chaplains or social workers who have, or who have said they have. But again, like if you're just normal, you're not a clairvoyant person.
I'm not
I wouldn't
normal. Is that
expect.
what you're saying, hospice nurse Patty? We've known that for years. Thank you. No,
Gifted. If you're
no,
not gifted
it's
in
an
that
ability,
way.
but you're sweet. I
Yeah.
gotcha. It's just, I thought that, since you were talking about it and, from your perspective, over the years, when we talk about the dying process, and you said, the body knows what it's doing. It's the rest of us that are learning, early on in your career, how that happens. Is there any perspective about over the years with you being involved in it, that how families that are involved, is there a difference? And I guess it would make sense, but in the sense that with families that are supportive through that dying process, as opposed to, oh my God, I'm speaking personally. My father was afraid of death, even though he knew what I did and what my mom did. And my bonus mom pushed off palliative care and just kept kicking the can down the road until it was 2 weeks before he earned his wings. And it was a hell or high water moment where we had to get, because of the distance where they resided. Is there a difference for the dying if they have that support early? I mean, for those that struggle with that process, in your opinion, obviously earlier intervention make a difference in the final moments?
Absolutely. Absolutely. People who are come onto service earlier get to a place of acceptance faster. People who don't accept can have terminal agitation. Symptoms are easier to manage if we can start low and move our way up, rather than we're getting somebody on service who's been experiencing an exacerbation of symptoms that have been uncontrolled, and we're all of a sudden having to try to throw everything at them to get those symptoms controlled. We have the chaplain available, we have the social worker. It's better for the patient, it's better for the family. We're able to talk about what to expect. And again, when you know what to expect, there's a lot less fear around it. If the family is less fearful, the patient will be less fearful. If the patient's less fearful, the family will be. It's just for us to be able to educate about, what is normal about the dying process allows people to digest that, and kind of come to grips with it. And it's absolutely easier when people come on to hospice earlier. I mean, we are the experts in death and dying, and we are there to help answer questions and manage symptoms. And the sooner that we get started on that, the better. And there's a reason why the Medicare benefit is for people with a life expectancy of 6 months or less. Not 6 weeks, not 6 days, 6 months, because there's a lot of preparation that can be done ahead of time. We have OT that can come out and help people like maintain their independence as long as possible, and help them to be safe so they don't fall, so they don't end up in the hospital. We help people to avoid the hospital and the ER and having to go to doctor appointments, and improve quality of life because they can actually do things that they want to do instead of sitting in a waiting room. There's just so many ways that we can help. And it is really sad when I hear that, like, somebody just didn't want to do it. They just couldn't do it. And usually, we always try to get to the root of that. Like, why your dad was afraid of death? Why was he resistant to hospice? Why? Probably because he thought going on hospice meant he would die faster, right? Or meant, at which he wouldn't, or just that it meant that he would die, which he was, like,
exactly.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
People are afraid to go on hospice because they think it's giving up hope, and it's not. We're just asking people to reframe what hope means to them. Maybe you're not going to live longer, but you're going to live better. Or they think that we're going to make them die faster. And actually, studies have proven that people who go on hospice can actually live longer than if they don't go on hospice. There are studies that prove that.
That's that. And I appreciate you bringing that up. I mean, it was a difficult time as, a former RNFA to walk that journey and to watch it happen. 2 days after I made the phone call and they were hired, they were then subsequently fired. And my father passed in an ICU with very unempathetic people. And it was not the best death he could have had. Although I was with him at his last moments, which I'm forever grateful but it could have, it just, and that's why I share that personal journey that, one of my dear friends who I started my nurse practitioner journey with, Kelly, was a hospice nurse. And, she just has given, she was a great advocate for me, and tried as she did. My suggestions fell upon deaf ears, but hopefully anybody hearing your story or hearing your background will learn from my family's mistakes and your knowledge to say, hey, there's a better way to do this. Now, when you talk about family support, is it different for different? And I love the Rainbow Nation. I'm part of it, but I also, I grew up where there was an appreciation for Allah, for Buddha, for the Jewish faith. There was very much diversity in my mom's clientele and in our living room or in our dining room on a Sunday, dinner. So is it different for those different types of people? I'll just say, let's just bring up, the LGBT community. Is it any different having them going through the dying process than I'll say a straight couple?
The dying process is going to be the same physically. I mean, similar as far as what they go through, although sometimes there may be more terminal agitation. The family support can look different. In my experience with patients who I had who were gay, it seems like if I think about it, most of the time there wasn't as much family support, especially with older people, because of that generation. It's not as accepted. So, I can specifically think of one couple that I took care of, a married couple, and in fact, I talk about this in my book.
Mm-hmm.
Influencing
death.
Right. Influencing death. My patient was an older gentleman, and he was 20 years older than his husband. And his husband's family was very accepting because younger people tend to have younger parents who are more accepting. Like, we're just moving ahead in life, right? Most of us are trying to move ahead and be more accepting of this. But my patient was an older man. He was, I want to say he was like 60 and his husband was 40. And so the 60-year-old's family rejected him when they found out he was gay. So he had zero family support from his family, but his husband's family was more supportive of him. But he did have terminal agitation, partly because he had liver disease, and also just because he had gone through a lot of, struggle in his life to be who he was, because his family just didn't accept him. So we can see things like that, and I had another patient, a young man whose mother was okay with the fact that he was gay, and he was actually dying of cancer related to AIDS, which, by the way, I've actually rarely had patients who died of AIDS. That's how good the medications became.
Yes. I started my nursing career with the AIDS epidemic, and I remember going in like dawning COVID. COVID brought back the what I'd had to wear to go in to care for AIDS patients. And that's why it's near and dear to my heart that you share this story. So tell me further about this gentleman, the second.
Yeah. So his mother was more accepting of him and was there to support, but his dad was nowhere to be found. He had no relationship with his dad because of being gay and because of having AIDS. And, his dad was really vehemently against homosexuality and felt like he deserved to get AIDS. And
right.
It was sent by
so
he had the support
above.
from his mom. So really, it's a little more complicated sometimes with those types of situations. I've never had a trans patient. We almost had one at one point, but then she ended up not coming to us. And I'm kind of sorry I didn't get to experience that, because I'm very pro-trans. I have a lot of admiration and respect for the trans community. I feel like they overcome so many really, obstacles to be authentically who they are. So I really wish that was something that I had had an opportunity to do. But, speaking of AIDS, I wasn't a nurse during the AIDS epidemic, but I was a young woman. I graduated in 1980, had a lot of gay friends, who died from AIDS, a lot. So yeah, I was definitely experiencing that and surprised as a hospice nurse. Like, I mean, I have a very close friend who's my age, 63. He's 63 now, who's still alive with AIDS. And at one point in his life, his T cell count was down to 1. He had the lone T cell, and then completely, yeah. I even asked him at one point, like he started doing the medications, and I said, so now your T cell count is back to normal. What does that mean? Does that mean you're HIV positive again, but not full blown AIDS? And he said they don't even really know
They
what
don't
to call
know.
it.
Right.
Yeah, he's lived so long with it, you know.
Wow.
But I was really surprised. I think I've had 2 AIDS patients. One was a woman, and the other one was that young man, who was a violinist in the symphony. Yeah.
Oh, wow. See, it's those people that touched your heart, and you can see it just talking to you
Mm.
about the experiences of dealing with. Is there having a better death? If I paraphrase, you know,
A good death.
a good death. So how do you think? Because we've come a while through the AIDS journey and everything. How do you think the the doctors are dealing? Because I've had situations where they don't want to talk, like they just, I can speak from a family member who clearly was in the end stages of her life, and nobody prior had said this is it, and
Mhm.
she was shocked that they couldn't do anything more because no one wanted. They kicked the can down the road. So do you think the
Yeah.
medical field has gotten better with now that we have hospice nurses? And I wanted to touch upon
I
death
mean,
doula. I mean, your thought on that. Yeah.
they're starting to get better, but we have a long way to go still. And I know this because we still have a lot of patients who come on service who are full code patients, because their doctors have never talked to them about, what that means, and that they, at the end of their life, I mean, should be a do not resuscitate, not full code. But I mean, I had a doctor one time who, my patient was an elderly lady in an adult family home. I don't know if you have those where you're at, but it's basically a home, where people can be sick people who, instead of a nursing home, they can be an adult family home. So she was in an adult family home. She was very close to the end of her life, really starting to have a lot of pain and respiratory symptoms and needing morphine. And the adult family home said, we can't really, it's not really within our scope to assess for pain, to be able to give PRN meds. It'd be better if we had an order for scheduled morphine. And so, and the family was all for it. They were like, yes, we do not want her to suffer. She needs to have medication around the clock so that she can be comfortable. And I called her provider, because in hospice, the way it works is a person gets to keep their provider, whoever that is. So I called her provider, and he just reamed me out and said, I know what you people do in hospice. You just give them morphine until they die. I'm not going to give you an
Wow.
order for that. And I was just like, what? So I called the hospice provider, my hospice team doctor, and he said, let me call him. I'll do a doc to doc and I'll talk to him. So then my doc calls me back and he says, that guy was such an asshole. He said, I cannot believe how
Just because they
unprofessional
have
he
a white
was.
coat doesn't mean they aren't.
Right. And he
Yeah.
said, he said, in the end, he said, I could do whatever I want. So yes, I'm giving you the order, for scheduled around the clock morphine. So I got the order, but I was blown away. I was
Wow.
just blown away that doctor was so ignorant, incredibly ignorant and rude too, But yeah, we do encounter that where people are just, when I was working at the hospice care center, the oncologist called to ask after a patient, and I said she died,
Uh-oh.
and he said she died, and I said, well, yeah, she died. Oh, okay. Like he was surprised that she died.
Died. Right.
Like, you are the oncologist who said treatment's not working, you should go to hospice, and she died. I had a patient come over from the hospital one time, actively dying. The wife was with him. He was actively dying. And I took her aside and I said, has anybody talked to you about how much longer they think he has? And she said, no. And I really want to know. And I said, don't leave. do not leave. And he died within an hour. So yeah,
I've
it's
seen
still a
that for
problem.
hospitals that and I'm not blaming hospitals, but it comes down to someone having that honest, because it's the adage, well, we treat the disease and the nurses treat the patient like the holistic part of it. And I've seen that myself, where it just is, like I said, personally, with my aunt. And it was like, no one said I was like, what? You can't do anything more? And that was like 6 months before she crossed. So, or less actually. But, I'm hoping that as we have educators like yourself who come back and spend time and share your story over what it's like to be a hospice nurse, how you take the skill set that you have, that you build upon. I wanted to ask you, have you had an experience with a death doula by any chance?
I have not.
Okay.
Hospice doesn't typically employ death doulas.
Mm-hmm.
Hospice gets paid a daily rate, and that covers everything that we do: nursing, chaplain, social worker, medication, everything, like the equipment, everything. And so death doulas are not considered billable, and hospices don't operate on a very big budget. And also we have chaplains and social workers who can do what the death doulas are doing. Death doulas do non-medical care. They don't replace the nurse. They do have more time to spend. So this is the analogy I use. Like, a social worker will help somebody choose a funeral home by giving them a list of funeral homes and giving them some pointers. A death doula can actually sit down and make the calls with the family because they have the time to do that. But it's not reimbursable by insurance, the same as a birth doula. It's not reimbursable. So it's a business. So people who are death doulas have to own their own business and charge whatever they're going to charge to do that. And so it's like a private pay. People have to have the money. So if you have money to burn, a death doula can be really helpful for a lot of people. But if you have some money to spend, but not a whole lot of money to spend, then I actually recommend people hiring a caregiver, like a nursing assistant, someone to come in and maybe do a night shift providing care, or on top of what because the hospice aides can come in a few times a week and do bathing and really teach the family how to do that care. But if you're someone who doesn't want to be changing adult depends overnight, that type of thing, then you can hire someone for that. So it's really a matter of how do you want to spend your money. And if you don't have a lot of money, but you have some, you get more bang for your buck if you hire like a nursing assistant.
And that's great points, because I know when my father-in-law was going through the process, they were under the impression that, well, hospice is involved and we have 24/7 care. Oh, what?
Mm-hmm.
Nope. They do assessments.
Yeah.
They set you up. They do assessments depending upon, and states run differently, I'm sure. But the nurse would come in maybe 2 to 3 times a week for an assessment, especially if there was a change. Aides would come in for an hour and a half a day, and that was it. And so this is, especially if you don't have the support system close by, I was blessed to pitch in and be a part of both my aunts and my father-in-law's care in that way. But absolutely, that's a great suggestion. Getting somebody for that overnight so you can rest and be everything that your person needs during the waking hours.
It's the Medicare benefit is a federal benefit with federal guidelines for all hospices. So it should be the same wherever you're at. Some state programs will have, like Medicaid can provide more, like they call it COPES in Washington State. I don't know what it's called in other places, where you can get a caregiver, but it still isn't going to be 24/7. It's still not.
It isn't. So are there any other recommendations that you may have for somebody walking this journey?
Yeah, I want to go back and touch on what we were talking about in terms of how do you get someone to where they need to be, like you were trying with your stepmother to get to where they, and I really, really like to encourage people to really dig deep and find out what the root problem is. What is their concern by asking questions? What is your concern about hospice? What are your fears around hospice? Why don't you want to go to hospice? That type of thing. Because if you can kind of dig into that, it's easier to help kind of ease them into that direction. If you're knowledgeable enough about hospice, which is, if people follow me on social media or read my book, they will be knowledgeable enough about it to be able to say, no, actually, no, hospice does not cause a person to die faster. Actually, no, they're not going to take away all your medications. People think we're going to stop all your medications. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to encourage you to let us discontinue the medications that are no longer benefiting you, which people are all about that. I've never had a patient who was upset that they had to stop taking a handful of meds, because people are taking vitamins and minerals and preventatives and, statins and stuff. They don't need that stuff anymore. And they're like, they're getting a whole med cup full of meds, especially in a nursing home. And when you tell them, yeah, guess what? We don't have to do all these meds anymore. They're pretty happy about that, or no, we're not going to starve you to death. We're going to let you eat whatever you want. In fact, if you're diabetic and you don't want to be on a diabetic diet anymore, okay, that's fine with us. Like there are things that we're going to be able to do to make life better for them, but they're most often operating from a place of fear is what it really comes down to. Is they're afraid that, like I said, it's going to make them die faster, or that they're going to give up hope and die. And we're not about that at all.
No. And I appreciate you walking that back, because, and the root cause for my family or for that situation is she didn't want him to die. So if she didn't deal with it, then he wasn't going to die. And that may sound so simplistic, but
no, I mean, it may sound simplistic, but it's extremely common. But people just think if they don't address it, it won't happen. If I don't say the words dead, dying, died, or, death, then it won't happen. But of course it will.
Right.
None of us gets out of here alive.
Well, that's a good way of putting it. So with that, I often ask my guest if there's a mediumship moment where maybe one of your clients had crossed and communicated with you, or a family member. Do you have anything that happened that was kind of like, I don't want to say spooky dooky, but just like, something that made you go,
Yeah, well, never any patients. And people ask me that too. They're like, have any of your patients ever come back to you? And I always think, why would they? I was only there for this much of their life. I was just their nurse. If they're going to come back, they're going to come back to their family, the people they love. But my dad came back to me after he died. But the spooky part about my dad's death isn't that he came back to me. It's what happened as he died. So my dad was a collector of many, many things. And one of the things that he collected was hats. And he had this beam downstairs in their family room where he had all these pegs, and he had hats upon hats hanging up, all these hats. And the hospital bed was downstairs. So, because that was really the best place for it. And he didn't have to go up and downstairs to get to the hospital bed as he was sick and he had a pulmonary disease. He ended up in the hospital, and the plan was for us to take him home on hospice the next day. And my dad was only on hospice for 12 hours, and not because we didn't want that for him. It's because the doctors kept telling me that they felt like they had figured out what was going on and he was going to be just fine. And I constantly was going at them with, I'm a hospice nurse. He had idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and he developed pneumocystis carinii. Okay, so pneumocystis carinii, it's common with AIDS patients, and they actually have a better prognosis. Somebody with a compromised immune system like he had due to steroid use and chemo drugs have a 50% chance of survival. So I already knew, like, this is not good. But they were constantly, oh yeah, no, it's going to be fine. Well, then he ended up in the ICU on a BiPAP. And my dad said, they're talking about like, maybe I have a year left to live. They're talking about hospice. And I was like, well, that doesn't even make sense because hospice is for 6 months or less. And my mom said, yeah, you need to call the doctor because we are so confused. So I called the pulmonologist and he said, yeah, your dad had an event this morning. And he said, I actually think he's a full code and he's going to end up intubated. And I don't think he wants that. And I said, he definitely does not want that. Can we get a hospice consult? And he said, yes, I think that's a good idea. So hospice came in, had the consult, and the plan was we needed to swap out the equipment at their house because home health comes from a different bucket
It does.
than hospice.
Yes.
So we had to swap out the home health equipment for the hospice equipment. So that we would take him home the next day. So we were all at the hospital, and it was, my mom loves hospice, even though he was on it for less than 12 hours because he had SIADH, so he was on liquid rationing, like he couldn't have very much liquid. He was on a diabetic diet. And my dad was a big guy who loved to eat. He loved to drink. He was so thirsty. So immediately I poured him a whole big thing of Dr. Pepper. And my mom was like, no, he's only supposed to have 4 ounces. And I was like, he's on hospice now. He can have whatever he wants. And then we went out and got him a huge meal at, I call it the meat buffet, the Golden Corral. And we piled up all this meat on there. And so we said, okay, we'll see you tomorrow, and went home. And I live in another city, so I was staying there, and I was downstairs. My mom went upstairs to go to bed. My brother was downstairs with me on the computer, and I was laying in that hospital bed, and I was looking up at all those hats, and I was thinking, wow, look at all those hats hanging up there. He has so many hats hanging up there. And the phone rang, and it was the nurse. And she said, you need to come. And I said, okay. And I hung up the phone and grabbed my brother and grabbed my mom, and we're driving to the hospital, and my brother's phone rings. And I answer it because he's driving. And she says, is Brad there? And I said, well, this is Penny. I'm his sister. You just talked to me. What's going on? And she said, your dad just died. And I said, oh, okay. So we got to the hospital, and she knew I was a hospice nurse. So she asked me, do you want to know what happened? And I said, yes. And she said, well, he was having trouble breathing. So I got him a little morphine. And then he said to me, I'm about ready to hang it up. So I went and got him some Ativan. And when I came back, he was agonal breathing and he died. And I thought, my dad said, I'm about ready to hang it up. Right when I was looking at those hats hanging up there, thinking about all those hats hanging up on the ceiling. She left the room to call me right after he said that.
That's truly, that is truly an amazing story. Thank you for sharing it.
I consider that a shared death experience is what I think of that as.
Yeah, right. Exactly. That's a good way of putting it, Penny. That's truly, when you have those moments, does he ever swing by and let you know he's in town?
No, but he definitely came to me after he died. In the form of energy. He was bright, brilliant, warm orange light, speaking to me in his voice. That happened. He came to my sister in a different form. She was going through a really difficult time, and it was quite a bit. And my family kept saying, why you, why not us?
Yes.
Well, my brother's an athist, so that's not going to happen for him because he's not even open to that.
There you go. That's probably,
but yeah. I said, I felt like I'm more connected to death, through my work as a hospice nurse. I'm more connected to death. And so for my sister, it was different. He came a couple years after his death, during a time when she really needed him because she was going through a hard time with her daughter. Mm-hmm. And he was a figure. He was sitting on a bench next to a dark figure and basically giving her advice that turned out to be great advice. And then my mother, it took a long time before my mother had experiences with him, and she would say it was a wisp, and I said, what's a wisp? It's just a wisp. I don't know. And then I hear his voice, and he says, no, be careful. And I, would say, well, is it Dad? Well, I don't believe in the afterlife, and then when I pinned her down and was like, well, what do you think it is? Well, it sounds like Dad. Well, then I guess you believe in an afterlife.
Yeah. I take the adage that, at Albert Einstein, right? Energy can't be destroyed. It's only changed in its form. And yep.
Absolutely.
And so however they make their way to us, I think it's pretty amazing that your family all had different experiences. And I really appreciate you sharing your personal story over it. I just want to thank you again, Penny, for coming forward. Hospice nurse Penny, influencing death. Get this. Read this, because as you say, we're all headed out the same door, right? When we earn our wings, as I lovingly say. It's chock full of stories, resources. It's an easy read, and dare I say a fun read. I enjoyed it because you were so forthright about the journey that you had taken. You can get it on you can get it at her website. Any place that has a bookstore, go get Influencing Death by Penny Hawkins Smith. Thank you so much for being my guest. I appreciate it. And as always, as I tell my guests, keep chatting with your angels because they can hear you.
Thank you. And people can follow me on social media as well.
Yes. At Instagram, Nurse Penny, Hospice Nurse Penny,
Facebook,
TikTok,
Instagram,
all
YouTube,
of them.
all of them. Yeah,
yes.
All of them at Hospice Nurse Penny. Yep.
Thank you again. I appreciate you being a guest today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time for another episode of Mediumship Moments. If you enjoyed this episode of Kim's podcast, check her out on Instagram and TikTok at Kim Durham Medium.